Hey you, what it do? It's Q from the illustrious slayermint.com, and we are going to be talking about averages and how everyone pretty much assumes that being in the middle or being in the average of something is the right way to go about things, and that that's the perfect balance. And in this world where we are increasingly seeing more millennials and kind of younger people enter the workforce who kind of grew up with these kind of rules, we're seeing it prevail more just in kind of society and government and things like this in general. So you're seeing people who grew up kind of getting a prize for coming, just, doing the race rather than for winning the race. And you're seeing people who kind of grew up with a socialist doctrine where they're kind of more used to pulling people who might win and do good down and then pull people who might do bad up, right? So you kind of have this averaging of everything and this equalizing of everything. And this is something that we're kind of becoming more used to, I guess. So let's kind of talk about that, right? Because in our simplistic thinking, it seems enticing and it seems kind of like the right thing to do is to find kind of that happy medium, right? Even with when we were kids, kind of some of these fairy tales that were read, like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, right? Goldilocks tries the first porridge and it's too warm. And then she tries the next porridge and it's too cold, and then she tries the final porridge, the third one, and it's just right. And this is kind of the way we view things, is that you want to kind of find that just right place where something is kind of the average. It's not too hot, it's not too cold, it's medium, it's in the middle. And this is kind of what tends to happen with everything. Like if you go into politics, you see that you kind of have the left and then you have the right. And if you're too far on the left, then you're extreme. And if you're also too far on the right, you're extreme also. So then we try to average it out and say, okay, well, maybe it's safe to be in the center, or try to find that compromise in the middle and to meet in the middle. And, that's kind of what happens with politics. A lot of people think it's smarter to just be moderate and to be in the middle and to not lean one way or the other. So we see that there, right? And then with regulation, we tell ourselves that too much regulation, well, actually we tell ourselves, first of all, we need regulation because you can't just let businesses and people do whatever they want. You obviously have to reel them in and you have to kind of keep them from hurting people or taking advantage of people or whatever. But then we also say, or we somewhat at least recognize that too much regulation is probably a bad thing. So maybe we need to allow for some freedom, but you can't have it completely regulated or like authoritarian where you're telling businesses and people kind of everything they can do. So we need to kind of find that happy medium with regulation. Inflation, same type of thing. We think that, well, we recognize too much inflation is a bad thing. If we have too much inflation, it's a mess. Prices are going to be expensive and people are, their money's not going to go as far. But of course we have to have some inflation, right? Because inflation is totally normal and natural. So we try to find that perfect amount, that percentage of inflation. Too much inflation, you have prices that are too high. People can't afford stuff. Too little inflation, we tell ourselves, well, then people aren't going to be able to, the economy is going to come to a halt. People aren't going to buy things, and you need to have inflation to kind of keep things going, keep the economy going. And so we kind of try to find the average, or we try to meet in the middle with inflation. And we see this in like everyday categories too, like just even work. If you work too much, you become boring, you're not having fun, you're not doing anything with other people, you're just kind of obsessed with work, and you're missing out on certain things. But if you work too little, you aren't going to be able to afford things probably, right? You're not making money or being constructive or learning a skill, and that could also be dangerous and not a good thing. So we try to find a balance between work and play. And, I think most people have kind of experimented with that and gone through that before. But then even with government and the way we manage government, we vote. And our voting is democratic. And democratic implies that we are trying to basically average everybody's view on something. So we want to decide how to handle something. We take a democratic vote, everybody has an equal say, and then whatever the majority is, or whatever the criteria for that said thing is, whatever wins based off votes is what we do. So we average kind of everybody's opinion on something. And that's even how we do government. So we're pretty much obsessed with averages and finding the middle. The way we do our government itself is based on that, right? So yeah, like I said, you have even ideologies built around that, like socialism. That's a big part of socialism, is to bring inequalities and to basically flatten inequalities and to kind of pull down more rich people or more privileged people, bring up less privileged, poorer people, and try to kind of find that meeting in the middle. They want to have equality of outcomes. So that's going on with this also. You're averaging things out in socialism. Capitalism, not so much. Even with genders, we're seeing kind of an averaging where it's not okay for genders to be unique anymore, right? So a man and a woman, they can't really be unique to their own biological preferences or realities. Instead, you're kind of anything a man should do, a woman should be able to do, and anything a woman can do, a man should be able to do. So we kind of are even trying to average out genders and kind of create just a human that is genderless, or at least kind of androgynous, to where these biological differences don't come into play. So we're seeing averaging pretty much everywhere we look. And now the thing is, the average is not always the best. We assume that it's the best, and kind of we do it with a lot of things, but just because we've been doing it for a while and that we assume that it is, doesn't mean that it is. Yeah, it's not, I'm not saying either that it's black and white, where it's either one way or the other way. Of course, there's always kind of gray areas and exceptions and things like this, but there are certain things that are not gray, that are pretty much black and white, where we don't want the average. So if we look at something like cancer, we do not want to find the happy medium of cancer, right? We don't want to say, well, we don't want to say cancer is bad, but maybe we should have just a little bit of cancer, right? Because if we have only cancer and full cancer, that's bad. But no cancer might also be bad too, so we want a little bit of cancer. We don't say that. We understand cancer and recognize it as being bad, so we just don't want any cancer. We're okay saying we want no cancer. Same thing with something like rape, right? So rape, we don't want a little bit of rape. We want no rape. People recognize rape is bad. There's not a scenario where rape is good, so we just say we don't want rape. We don't go to try to find the average or the right ratio of rape like we do with something like inflation. We get that rape is bad. Murder. That's probably the most obvious. We don't think a little bit of murder is needed, or we need some small ratio of murder to have society function. We get that murder is bad, so we don't want the average or some compromised amount of murder. We want no murder, right? So it's clear on certain things that we don't want balance, and we don't want to kind of find an average. We want to have none of it. And these things, well, so the question then becomes, where do you draw the line on what you want? Where do you draw the line between how much you want of something and how little you want of something, and whether you want anything of that at all? And that's obviously a tricky question, and that's why we're kind of confused on a lot of things. And I think to a degree there's a preference aspect coming into it, but there's also a part of intelligence coming into it, where I think smarter people are better able to figure out kind of where to draw the line. And that smartness comes from your understanding of something. Because when you understand something better, you're able to kind of see the pros and cons of it and kind of know the quantities or how much you want of it to have. And then even on top of that, it's different to each person. Not everybody wants the same amount of certain things. So it's kind of just a mistake in general to think that everyone should have the same amount of something or have the same preferences for something. Yeah, of course, like something like murder, nobody really wants any of that. But other things, it's not so clean cut, and it could weigh a little bit more, like say work or something like that, or gender or things. It's not always supposed to be like a strict way or one way or the other, and it can be preferential. But the intelligence piece comes into it a lot too. Okay, now, so with government then, do we want to have a lot of government or do we want no government, right? Do we want to be on the left or do we want to be on the right? Well, again, it depends now how we define government. If we're defining government as something that is necessary for society and that is beneficial and, we need them to provide military and police and things like this, then we probably want some government. But if we were to define government as a monopoly on violence, then we probably don't want any government, right? And so what happens is it comes down to how you define things and the brand of, well, so what we do is we create a brand for a word and we look at the word itself rather than the principles or the understanding that are behind that word, right? So when we think government, we don't look at like kind of what's actually going on in government. We just look at the word and kind of the brand that we're sold. And that misleads us. And that's why smarter people kind of see beyond the words. They see kind of the unseen. And that allows them to have a better perception and make better decisions and have more accuracy. So with government, government can only survive off taxation and inflation. And in order to get money, the government has to take it from productive people in society. And to do this, they tax people. And if you don't pay your taxes, the government is going to come after you and get the taxes with physical force, right? So government depends on that monopoly on violence. You cannot opt out of government. And if you define and look at government from that lens, it kind of changes the way you view government. Now, if we look at something like inflation, right? So what we're sold, or the brand for that word is inflation is kind of a necessary good thing. We always have kind of real estate prices going up. You always have kind of a small percentage, like 2% of inflation every year. And it's perfectly normal and good. And that's kind of the story and the brand behind inflation. But if you actually define and look further what inflation really is, inflation is simply an increase in the money supply. So when we create more money, we get inflation. It's an increase in the money supply. And if we see that an increase in the money supply is never a good thing, then why would we want any inflation, right? So if we have a money supply and you have $10, and now we double the money supply, your $10 is no longer worth $10. It becomes worth $5 because it buys half as much because there's twice as much money to go around. So in this case, inflation, well, this is what inflation is, and that's never a good thing. You want to, if anything, you'd want deflation. You'd want your money to be worth more and more as time goes on. So if we define inflation more accurately, instead of just kind of the brand and the selling point that the government gives us, then we can see that if we don't want a small amount of inflation, we want no inflation, right? And then you could even look at the way we vote democratically, right? So we vote democratically, everybody gets an equal say, and we assume that that's the way to go. But the question is then, why don't businesses vote democratically? Why are businesses hierarchical? Why do businesses have it to where the people who start the business and the leaders in the business, why do they have more say in a business? And why do people lower down who are less productive and who offer less value, why do they get little say or no say? Why is it where in business, say, the kind of your voting power is relative to the value that you offer and your understanding, knowledge, and wisdom that you have in that particular area? Where in government, even if you're an idiot, you still get a vote. And if you're super smart, you only get one vote, right? So we want to average it with democratic voting in government, which is kind of not necessarily the best thing to do. If it was, more businesses would do it, but they clearly don't because businesses aren't stupid and they know what's going to get the best results and to kind of optimize everything in the most favorable way for consumers and people using their products, right? So we don't see that happening with business. And business obviously knows how to run things better than government, which is why all the great things we have in our life, cell phones, computers, whatever, they all come from businesses who invent them and come up with them, and government doesn't do anything. All they do is halt everything and slow it down through taxation. So voting democratically, not necessarily the most wise thing to do if you want to efficiently use kind of knowledge and the value that people have. So, and then even with regulation, right? So like I said, you have a preference aspect to things too. So regulation, rather than letting a person decide what level of service they want with a business, right? Maybe somebody wants to take a risk and go with a super risky business that's less expensive. With regulation, that choice is taken away from them. And now the government decides kind of what choices you can have, what businesses you're allowed to participate in, and which ones you're not. So they regulate it, and it takes away choice. So what happens now is you have more security at the cost of freedom. So you have less freedom and more security as you increase regulation. And then as you decrease regulation, you have more freedom, right? Because you have more choices over what you can do, but it's more risky, so you have less security. You might make a mistake yourself. So now the decision comes away from government, and the decision making comes into you as you remove regulation. And for some people, that's a great thing, right? You have maximum choice. You're able to more freely do what you want to do. But for a lot of people, that's also a bad thing, because now they're going to mess up and they're going to get screwed, and they would rather have somebody else kind of decide for them what's best for them. So it kind of depends on your preference in a way, right? But more intelligent people are clearly going to choose less regulation because they want the most freedom, and they don't give a crap about security because they can decide for themselves what risk and what security level is right for them. They're not stupid. So yeah, once again, if we take it back to something simple like rape, we know that we don't want any rape. And we know this because we understand rape completely. And if we understand things completely, we are more easily able to determine whether or not we want it and how much of it we want. And since nobody really understands anything, especially about kind of more complex topics, because they don't study or read, well, then they're not going to know, and they're just going to kind of go with the average, right? So these personal thresholds, it's something that we need to discover for ourselves, but it's not safe to assume that taking the middle road is always the right way to go. In fact, what happens is people who know less about something, or people who are lazy or don't care, they're going to be more inclined to go with the averages because they don't give a crap, right? It's easy to not care. But when it comes to something that you do know about or something that you do want, then you're not going to want the average of it. You're going to want the most complete form of it, and you're going to want the most amount of it possible, right? If you know what you want, you don't want half of it. You don't want 25% of it. You want all of it. But if you don't know what you want, you don't know what degree, or you don't care what degree of it you have. And that's why we see this so much with government, business, and things related to life itself. We're just seeing kind of people who don't have a preference because they don't know, so they don't care. Now, when we look at motivational material, right? Because it's funny, most people see motivational material as good, right? They self-help or wanting to grow and evolve yourself and learn and build yourself. These are things that people see as good, but yet people don't want to take into heart or into practice the principles that come with this type of stuff, right? So when it talks about never giving up, when it talks about working harder or reaching for the stars or going up against adversity or all these kind of things, that's when people kind of fall off and they don't want any of that. And they don't want to do decisions that require that. So they pay lip service to kind of these things, and they pay lip service to principles that create excellence, but when it comes to actually doing it themselves, they don't want to do it. They want to just take the average, right? So when you have a race, we don't award middle place. We don't award the average. We don't even care about the average. We care about who got first place and who won it. That's what we care about. And we care about that because that brings excellence. It brings quality. And it allows for the favorable aspects of something and for the good of something to rise and for the bad to fall, right? So when it comes to a race, the person who gets first place, they're the best, at least with all the people participating. So they're the best at doing that particular thing. And the person who gets last place is the worst at it. And so whatever the race is, we want the best of it, and that's what this first place represents. And we see the same thing with business. The businesses that are best, we want them. We want the ones that can do whatever we want in the most complete, accurate, and best way. And the ones that suck, we want them to go away and figure out how to do something that maybe they're more inclined to do another way, or something else. Maybe that's not the right thing for them. Maybe they can excel with their strengths somewhere else. Right? So we know this with races and competition in sports and whatever, that we don't want to award middle place, even though that's kind of what we're doing these days, is we just award anybody for participating. But it's going to create a decline in quality, and everybody's going to lose because of it. We want to reward the people that do well, because these are the people that are producing and that are providing that thing that we want by them doing it. They're doing it to the best ability. So you want to award the people doing what you want to the best ability. And now, since we call everything incorrectly, right? So we call poison medicine. And then something that's medicine, we call it poison. So we don't know how to accurately define things. So we mix the two up. And since we don't know, we just mix it all together in a giant concoction of average, and we just assume that that's the best way to go. Rather than kind of seeing what's what. We mix it all together, we average it, and we think that that's the way to go, rather than kind of understanding each thing in its own respective way. So I wanted to share that with you and show you that it's not always best to take the average. We don't want the average amount of cancer. We don't want the average amount of regulation. We don't want the average amount of rape. We don't want the average amount of murder. We need to first understand what these things are so we can understand it, right? We don't want the average amount of poison. But if what we think is medicine is really poison, then taking an average of it's a pretty stupid thing to do, but we think it's a smart thing to do. So we need to really understand what we're talking about here and understand whether or not we want the average of it. So thanks for listening, everyone, and have a spectacular day.